Rousing welcome back to our podcast. 'Tis but a scratch, fact and fiction about the Middle Ages. I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels, and I should begin with an apology to our listeners. It's been months since I last posted an episode. I had to leave off podcasting because of a spell of bad health, and because I had to finish a chapter about warfare in early medieval Britain that I owed to a very patient editor. But we are finally back. Today we will be talking about King Alfred of Wessex and whether he deserves to be called the Great. My co-host for this episode is my partner for life, inspiration for all things medieval, and my reality check, my wife, Ellen.
Rule Britannia? That's not our usual musical introduction.
No, but it's appropriate for this episode. Rule Britannia was the climactic musical number in the Masque Alfred, composed by Thomas Arne with lyrics by James Thomson, written and performed in 1740 for Frederick, Prince of Wales. Prince Frederick was the estranged eldest son of King George II. He distinguished himself from his German father by embracing a British identity. Frederick took as his models Edward the Black Prince and King Alfred.
Black Prince? Not a fortunate choice, given that he died before his father, King Edward III, and never became King Edward.
Not fortuitous, but prophetic, since Frederick also predeceased his father. Frederick, even before he came to England, had been the dedicatee for a pretty awful and long-forgotten epic poem about good King Alfred. In 1740, Frederick commissioned this musical stage play celebrating Alfred's naval victory over the Danes in a fleet manned by honest English countrymen.
What was it about Alfred that attracted Frederick, and why a musical play about him?
The Masque was a political statement. In the first half of the 18th century, Alfred became a symbol of traditional English political liberty and was embraced as such by the political opponents of King George II and his Prime Minister, Robert Walpole. The Patriot Whigs and the Tory Country Party both held Alfred up as a king who ruled in consultation with the Witan, the forerunner of Parliament, and praised him as the father of the common law. Naval power was also a political issue. The country Tories, in particular, criticized George II's employment of Hessian mercenaries. In the Masque, the song Rule Britannia is the joyous, triumphant response of the English people to news of Alfred's victory over the Danes at Edington in 878, a victory won by patriotic Englishmen defending their nation's liberty. The nations not so blessed as thee must in their turns to tyrants fall, while thou shalt flourish great and free, the dread and envy of them all.
Rule Britannia, Britannia, rule the waves, Britons never ever... I can't do this.
Okay.
But Edington was a land battle.
Yeah, but by 1740, Alfred was already being credited with founding the Royal Navy.
I'm glad we're finally going to talk about King Alfred. You've been promising an episode on him for months, even before the break.
Actually, this will be the first of 3 episodes about Alfred the Great. Today I'm going to give my overview of his reign and explain why I think that he deserves to be called the Great. In follow-up episodes, we'll be talking about Alfred with 2 distinguished historians of Anglo-Saxon England, Dr. Barbara York, emeritus professor at the University of Winchester in the UK.
Emeritus? Shouldn't that be emerita?
It's a linguistic quirk. The gender of the Latin word professor is masculine, hence, whether it's a female or a male professor, it's always emeritus.
Well, okay, but I'm still going to go with emerita.
In the 3rd episode, I'll be chatting with Dr. Ryan Lavelle, also of the University of Winchester. Ryan is a renowned historian of Anglo-Saxon warfare and was the historical consultant on the BBC television show, The Last Kingdom, based upon the Saxon Chronicles series by historical novelist Bernard Cornwell.
For any listeners who don't know this, Richard is the author of a biography of King Alfred. Quote, Alfred the Great wore a kingship and culture in Anglo-Saxon England, close quote, published in 1998 by Longman's Medieval World Series.
Which I'm now revising for a 2nd edition for Rutledge to take into account new scholarship about King Alfred.
I'm afraid to ask, when was it you signed that contract for the new edition?
No need to go there. Let's just say that it will be to my publisher within a year. And I give you my blessings to nag me as much as you think it necessary.
I only do it out of love.
Ellen was my first editor for the biography. When I turned in what I then thought was the final manuscript, my publisher told me that he loved it, but that it was too long for the series. He asked me to cut it by 15%. I had slaved over every word and couldn't do it. So I turned it over to Ellen and asked her to make the cuts.
I decided not to make cuts at the sentence or even paragraph levels. My guiding principle was that a biography is supposed to be about a person. If Alfred didn't appear for 3 pages in a row, those pages became a candidate for the cutting board.
A lot of historical context went, but Ellen did a wonderful job. I then wrote new paragraphs to preserve continuity. So, Elle, based on my book, do you think that Alfred was great?
I know that when you began writing the book, your goal was to pull Alfred off his pedestal. I think you said that your intention was to present him as an English Charles Martel, an early medieval warlord with great PR.
Yeah, there have been so many biographies of King Alfred, and I wanted to write something really different and original.
Well, in a way, you failed.
Yes, I did. I had almost completed my introduction when I had to stop writing and come to grips with the realization. The sources wouldn't allow me to write the book that I thought I wanted to write. The more I studied Alfred and his reign, the more impressed I became with him. But I was also very much aware that a primary reason for this is that almost all the sources for Alfred's reign, and there are more sources for his reign than for any other Anglo-Saxon king, almost all of them originated in Alfred's own court.
And what are these sources?
The 2 most important sources are a contemporary biography of Alfred by the Welsh monk Asser, who was one of the scholars that Alfred recruited for his court, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, an annalistic account of the formation of the main English kingdoms of Britain by Saxons, Angles, and Jutes from the continent, with an emphasis upon the rise of Alfred's own kingdom of Wessex. In addition to these, we have a number of writings by Alfred himself. We have his will. We have a law code he issued that includes an introduction that has snippets from Exodus. And we have Alfred's own translations of several Latin works that he believed were the key to inculcating wisdom. These are the Pastoral Care of Pope Gregory the Great, Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy, Augustine's Soliloquies, and the first 50 Psalms. With the exception of the Pastoral Care, these translations are free and idiosyncratic. Alfred's own interpolations have been used by scholars as a window onto the king's mind and personality.
And the authenticity of virtually all of them have been challenged by scholars.
They have, and I'm not persuaded by those challenges. A few years before my biography of King Alfred came out, Oxford University Press published a very large biography of Alfred by Dr. Alfred Smith. Smith believed that the life of King Alfred by Asser was actually a forgery written by an early 11th century monk of Ramsey named Bertford. Worse, he also believed there was a conspiracy in the academic community centered on Oxford and Cambridge, a conspiracy to silence those who would expose the fraud. Smith's quote-unquote discovery was brutally rejected by the academic community, which probably only confirmed his belief in the conspiracy.
You also rejected it, but remember you telling me that Smith credited you with doing so judiciously and politely.
I am convinced that Asser's biography is authentic, as most scholars now do. The most recent challenge has been to the authenticity of Alfred's translations of the Boethius and Augustine by Professor Malcolm Godden and Dr. Susan Irving.
So why is that important?
If these works are not by Alfred, we have lost our most important source for the inner man. But once again, I come down on the conservative side of the controversy.
Ironic for someone who originally wanted to be a revisionist historian.
Yeah, I'm well aware of that. But the arguments advanced by Godden and Irvine are simply not persuasive, either on historical or linguistic grounds. To be clear, I don't think that Alfred sat down by himself and translated these texts as a solitary activity.
You mean like the way the first Queen Elizabeth did her translation of Boethius?
Which she completed within a single month in 1593, while England was under threat of Spanish invasion. The translation survives in her own hand. Elizabeth's personal clerk, Windebank, in his memoranda, expressed his admiration for the Queen's industry and learning. One of the arguments against Alfred's authorship is that he couldn't possibly have found the time to do it. Clearly, those critics never looked into Elizabeth's translations of numerous Greek and Latin texts when she was queen. Translating seems to have been her alone time, her escape from the cares of ruling. Alfred's translations, in contrast, were translations by committee. Alfred firmly believed that good governance rests upon foundations of learning and piety. He recruited clerics known for their scholarship from neighboring English kingdoms and Francia to help him in his pursuit of wisdom. I believe that the West Saxon words in these translations are, in fact, Alfred's, though the ideas represent the collective wisdom of the learned faculty of his court. This is one of the reasons why I really need to complete the revisions for a second edition of my biography. I do sympathize in a way with Smith, Godwin, and Irvine. When plowing old ground, one really would like to find something new and significant to say about the subject.
I know that Alfred is commonly called the Great, the way that Ethelred is called the Unready, but my understanding is that Alfred is the only English king to be called the Great.
Actually, Canute is also called the Great, but that has more to do with his rule over a Scandinavian-based empire. So yes, Alfred is the only English king to be called the Great. Although he was an English king, he wasn't king of England, and I'll talk about that.
Was that a contemporaneous assessment or posthumous like it was for Ethelred?
Very posthumous. I mean, like centuries after. The first author to call Alfred the Great was a mid-13th century monastic chronicler, Matthew Paris. Matthew Paris added the words Alfredus Magnus, Alfred the Great, in the margins of the signature manuscript of his History of St. Albans Abbey, the Gesta Abbatum. In the marginalia, he explained that Alfred deserved to be called, quote, the Great on account of his merits, unquote. Not coincidentally, Matthew Paris also credited Alfred with being the first king of all England. But the designation, the Great, seems to have been a throwaway line. Elsewhere, Matthew Paris calls him Alfred the Wise, and that seems to have been Alfred's main nickname throughout the Middle Ages. It wasn't until the 16th century that Alfred once again became the Great, and it was in the late 18th century that the cult of Alfred began. This came to an apex during the reign of Queen Victoria.
I like the way that you started your biography with 3 modern statues of Alfred.
The Victorian cult of Alfred the Great is literally embodied in 2 statues. The earlier of the 2 was erected in Wantage, Berkshire in 1877. The statue was commissioned by Robert Lloyd Lindsay, 1st Baron, Wantage, to honor Alfred's birthplace. Lloyd Lindsay, who had won the Victoria Cross for his heroic actions in the Crimean War, felt a special affinity for Alfred, the warrior king. The sculptor, Count Gleichen, was a cousin of Queen Victoria, and the unveiling was presided over by the Prince and Princess of Wales. The 8-foot-tall statue stands upon a granite base in Wantage's Market Square. Alfred wears a close-fitting helmet, a tunic, a cape, and leggings. His right hand rests on top of the shaft of a war axe. In his left hand, he clutches a scroll held over his breast. Gleichen's intention was to represent Alfred's 2 sides, the warrior king who saved England and the scholar, and I think he succeeded.
But the statue in Winchester is still the more famous of the 2.
Yes, and the more monumental. It stands 17 feet high from the base to the tip of Alfred's outstretched arm. The statue was unveiled in 1901 as part of the celebration to mark the 1000th anniversary of Alfred's death.
Wait a minute, didn't Alfred die in 899?
Yeah, he did. The planners of the millenary celebration got it wrong, and they weren't alone. The error was due to a dislocation of 2 years in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. W. H. Stevenson, the editor of Astor's Life, pointed out the error in 1898, but it was pretty much ignored. 1901 proved to be a fortuitous year for the millenary, as it was also the year of Queen Victoria's death. A neat 1,000 years separated the deaths of England's two greatest monarchs. It also seems appropriate, as Victoria's marriage to the German Prince Albert helped spark interest in England's Anglo-Saxon heritage and the German roots of its monarchy. Winchester was chosen as the site for the celebration and statue because it was thought to have been Alfred's capital city. The sculptor was Hamo Thornycroft, who specialized in monumental public statues. In 1899, he had sculpted a statue of Oliver Cromwell to be placed before the palace at Westminster. Thornycroft's Alfred stands with his right arm raised high. In his hand, he holds a large sword with the blade pointed down, grasping it just below its hilt.
Okay, so it looks like a cross.
Exactly. Alfred is portrayed as a victorious Christian warrior king. Alfred's left arm rests upon a round shield. His dress is similar to that of the Wanted statue. Like the Wanted statue, he is bearded and wears a helmet, although this one has a crown. The inscription on the plaque is simple: to the founder of the kingdom and nation.
I like the Wanted statue better.
So do I, and I think the inscription on its plaque captures perfectly the Victorian ideal. Alfred found learning dead, and he restored it. Education neglected, and he revived it. The laws powerless, and he gave them force. The church debased, and he raised it. The lands ravaged by a fearful enemy, from which he delivered it. Alfred's name shall live as long as mankind shall respect the past.
You also wrote about a statue of Alfred at Alfred University in Alfred, New York. That one became quite a source of controversy on campus.
The sculptor, Professor William Underhill, who recently passed away, reconceived Alfred as a sort of Celtic hero dressed in Roman-style armor. The statue became the focus of controversy in 1991 when Alfred University's president proposed using it as the university's logo. After all, it is Alfred University. And some faculty and students protested that it undercut the university's claimed dedication to diversity and inclusivity to choose as its symbol a DWEM, a D-W-E-M.
Dead white European male.
Yes, a dead white European male. The protesters argued that choosing the statue as its logo would send a message to minority students that they don't belong. I believe in the importance of diversity, but I also think that the concerns of today are more foreign to 9th century Britain than Old English is to modern English.
And Old English is a completely foreign language. I don't remember reading about what happened after the protests.
Nothing much. Underhill's statue is still there. It isn't the university's logo, but it does appear briefly on the university's website in a montage showing buildings and student activities.
Okay, back to the question. As an historian, do you think Alfred deserves to be called the Great?
I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but yes, I do. Not as the Victorians conceived him, but as a 9th century ruler, most definitely. Great is also a loaded term. Great man history is very 19th century. Historical causation is complex. Academic historians know better than to credit a single individual with changing the course of history.
I sense a but coming up.
You know me so well. I think that Alfred did save Wessex from Viking conquest, and in doing so, he created the military, political, and ideological foundations for what would become the Kingdom of England. His greatness comes out in comparison with his contemporaries. He was the only English king to defeat the Vikings and preserve his kingdom from conquest. Of course, he didn't do this alone. Alfred had the ability to recognize and recruit talent. Lacking the power to coerce obedience, Alfred excelled at persuading the West Saxon nobility and clergy to undertake onerous and expensive tasks that he and his counselors deemed necessary for the welfare of the realm. I also admire Alfred's resilience and determination. Asser tells us that Alfred suffered intermittently from incapacitating stomach ailments, which some think may have been Crohn's disease. He dealt with this by reminding himself that God scourges those whom he loves. It did not prevent him as a youth from hunting and as an adult from leading troops into battle. While his brother-in-law, King Burghal of Mercia, was driven from his realm and retired to Rome, Alfred, in similar circumstances, established himself in an island stronghold in the marshes of Somerset to continue the fight. And I share his conviction that the foundation of good governance is the pursuit of wisdom, and applaud his efforts to promote learning among the secular ruling elite of Wessex.
I know you can go on about Alfred, but how about a quick overview of his reign and accomplishments?
Okay, first some historical context. Viking raids in England began toward the end of the 8th century and intensified in the 830s and 840s, the same time that Vikings were settling on the eastern coast of Ireland. At this time, Britain was a patchwork of Anglo-Saxon, Welsh, and Scottish kingdoms. Throughout the first half of the 9th century, Viking fleets had crisscrossed the Channel, alternately raiding in Francia and Britain. This changed in 865 when a large Viking fleet, described by the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as the Great Heathen Army, overwintered in East Anglia. Between 866 and 874, the Great Heathen Army ravaged and conquered the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. Initially, they set up native client kings who paid them tribute and promised to provide them with military aid when called upon. But in 876, a new phase began, one of settlement and direct rule.
I take it that the chronicler was making a point when he called it a great heathen army.
Mickle Hathen Hera. Each word was carefully picked. Mickle, great, emphasized the immensity of the force. Hathen emphasized the religious dimension of the struggle. This was a war against heathens, the enemies of Christ. And Hera meant army, but the word also implied an army of raiders.
How mickle was this Viking army?
Recent archaeological excavations of the Great Heathen Army's winter camp at Torksey in Lincolnshire give us some idea of its size. The camp encompasses 64 acres. That would have accommodated a very large army. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reports that the fleet that brought the Great Army back to England in 892 consisted of 350 ships, which would imply a force at least 7,000 strong and possibly double that number. But large round figures in early medieval chronicles are not reliable. My sense is that we're talking about maybe 5,000 combatants.
Okay, it was large and it was heathen, but it was really an army?
Not in the modern sense. For propaganda purposes, the chronicler presents it as a unified army. The greater the threat, the greater the glory to Alfred and the West Saxons. But like other large Viking fleets of the age, the Great Army was actually a composite force with a very loose command structure. It had leaders. Among them were Ivar the Boneless and his brothers Halfdan and Ubba, who in sagas, movies, and television shows are the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok.
Ragnar Lothbrok? Was he really a real historical figure?
Probably not. Historians think that he's a composite of several Viking chieftains, but making Ivar and his brothers sons of Ragnar, and having Ragnar killed by King Alla of Northumbria.
Yeah, right, by throwing him into a pit of poisonous snakes.
Well, the snakes had to go somewhere when Patrick cast them out of Ireland. Why not Northumbria? Anyway, the story told in the sagas provided a good medieval justification for the Viking conquest of Northumbria. It was an act of personal vengeance.
Wasn't that also how medieval authors explain Swen Forkbeard's conquest of England, as vengeance for the killing of his sister during the St. Brice's Day massacre?
Yeah, and it's equally bogus. It's unclear whether Ivar or any one person ever was in sole command of the Great Army. Large Viking raiding fleets were joint ventures united by a common goal, and cemented by individual pledges of loyalty. The most basic element in the leadership structure was the personal authority of the individual sea captains who commanded one or several longships. The number of ships a captain commanded was based on his status and wealth. Captains with royal blood were called kings. Other powerful chieftains might be known as jarls or earls.
Okay, back to Alfred. Who and what was he?
Alfred was the fourth son of King Athelwulf of Wessex. Alfred's grandfather, King Egbert, and his father Athelwulf had made Wessex the dominant English kingdom in southern Britain, wresting that distinction from neighboring Mercia. When Alfred ascended the throne in 871, Greater Wessex stretched from Cornwall in the west to Kent in the east, encompassing all of Britain south of the Thames River. It also included, at the time, Essex. As a fourth son, Alfred had little prospect of being king. But this was an age of high mortality, and at the age of 22 or 23, Alfred did become king, but only after each of his three elder brothers had reigned and died. Alfred came to the throne under dire circumstances. Wessex was under invasion. In the preceding winter, a Viking army under the command of two sea kings, Halfdan and Becgthed, had suddenly crossed the Thames and seized the strategically important royal estate at Reading. Reading gave them easy access to the Roman roads, trackways, and rivers, all the major lines of communications in the Middle Thames Valley. King Athelred and his brother Alfred raised forces to meet the threat. The year was marked by a series of battle skirmishes and raids. The West Saxons, led by King Athelred, managed to win a major victory at Ashdown on the Berkshire Downs, one in which Alfred distinguished himself, but they were unable to capitalize on it. Upon his brother's sudden death, on 15th of April, Alfred became king.
I know that Anglo-Saxon kings were quote-unquote elected by the secular religious magnates of the realm, and that all males who could claim descent from the founder of the dynasty, Cerdic, were eligible. Did Alfred face competition? Didn't his brother have a couple of sons?
Athelred had two sons, but they were very young. Asser wrote that Alfred was Athelred's secundarius. It's an odd term, but in this context, it may have meant his designated successor.
Wasn't that a Welsh practice, kings naming their successors?
Yes, medieval Welsh kings would name one of their kinsmen as the Tanist, the most worthy of succession. Asser, of course, was Welsh. He was also a partisan, writing retrospectively at a time when Athelred's sons had grown to manhood, and he may have been trying to justify Alfred's succession by saying that he was his brother's choice for the throne. Anglo-Saxon rulers undoubtedly lobbied for their preferred successor, but the choice was ultimately the magnate's to make. Given that Wessex was under invasion, Alfred, an experienced warrior who had led half of the West Saxon troops in the victory at Ashdown, was the natural choice.
That's got to be a tough way to begin a reign.
It became tougher. Alfred immediately confronted the Vikings at Wilton and lost. Asser described the battle, quote, "When both sides had been fighting violently and resolutely on all fronts for much of the day, the pagans realized of their own accord the complete danger they were in, and unable to bear the onslaught of their enemies any longer, they turned tail and fled. But alas, scorning the small numbers of pursuers, they advanced again into battle, and seizing victory, they were masters of the battlefield." End quote. Basically, the West Saxons abandoned the safety of their shield wall to pursue an apparently routed foe, and paid for their rashness when the enemy reformed and rounded upon them.
Sounds like what happened in the Battle of Hastings a couple centuries later.
Yes, though at least Alfred was more fortunate than Harold and survived the battle. Alfred's defeat at Wilton emphasized the importance of discipline in the battles of this period. Morale and discipline, rather than technology or even tactics, determined the outcome of this and Alfred's other battles against the Vikings. The Viking and the West Saxon forces were probably nearly evenly matched in terms of numbers and equipment. The ordinary warrior on both sides was armed with an ash wood spear, perhaps 6 to 8 feet in length, with a leaf-shaped iron spearhead. The spear was suitable for either thrusting or hurling. He bore on his left arm a round wooden shield, either flat or slightly concave, that protected him from his shoulder to his thigh. The shield's central iron boss protected the hand grip that lay under it. Warriors of higher status and wealth, whether West Saxon or Viking, were distinguished by their splendid, pattern-welded swords, the aristocratic weapon par excellence.
I remember an old English riddle. I am a wondrous creature, shaped in strife, loved by my lord, fairly adorned. And the answer is, of course, sword.
Several of these wondrous creatures survived from Alfred's time. The wealthiest may also have worn chain-mail burnies and simple conical helmets with nose guards. It's unlikely that the Vikings at this time used battle axes, the weapon that would characterize them in the 11th century, or that either side made extensive use of archers. Given the weapons at their disposal, it's not surprising that battles between West Saxon and Viking armies were in large measure pushing and thrusting matches. The standard battle formation was the shield wall, in which the warriors closed rank in preparation for rushing or receiving the enemy's attack. Battle tactics were rudimentary at best. In a typical engagement, the armies would approach in open order. At about 25 yards, each side would let loose a volley of spears, then close ranks and engage. In the battle itself, quote, winged spears, used like poleaxes, swords, and shields, became the main weapons, as warriors pushed and struck at one another in an attempt to disrupt the enemy's lines. As men fell in the front rank, the solid formations would again open, providing enough space to permit warriors to throw spears, slash with long swords, and parry blows with their shields. A battle was won when one side broke ranks and fled, leaving their opponents in possession of the field and of anything of value that could be looted from the dead and the dying.
That sounds a little like hoplite warfare in ancient Greece.
It's a type of battle tactics that could be mastered by amateur soldiers.
You left the newly crowned Alfred defeated on the battlefield, so what did he do?
He did what other English and Frankish kings had done in similar circumstances. He paid the Danes geld, that is tribute money, to leave Wessex.
And that is called paying the Dane geld. But we've proved it again and again, that if once you've paid him the Dane geld, you never get rid of the Dane.
Thank you, Mr. Kipling. But Kipling was right. The Vikings would return to Wessex. But for the next 5 years, the great army busied itself with subduing Mercia, placing a native client king on the throne, and putting down an uprising in Northumbria. Then, in the winter of 876, the Danes seized the town of Wareham on the coast of Dorset and began to raid. Alfred raised the royal army, the Third, and surrounded the town. The Anglo-Saxons apparently didn't have siege engines. Their idea of siegecraft was to surround a town and starve it into submission. It worked, and the Danes agreed to depart Wessex immediately if they were allowed to leave. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle proudly reports that they swore to do this, quote, on the sacred ring, which before this they would not do to any nation, end quote.
Wait a minute. The chronicler says that the Vikings swore an oath on a sacred ring. That doesn't sound Christian.
It wasn't. From the sagas, we know that this was the Ring of Thor. The way Christians ensured agreements was by taking oaths on Christian relics. This would hardly bind pagans, so apparently Alfred insisted that they take the oath on something that they regarded as holy.
Clever. And it does demonstrate how flexible and pragmatic Alfred could be.
More flexible when it came to religion than Asser apparently was. Asser was sufficiently embarrassed by his hero's willingness to engage in a pagan ritual that when he translated this annal into Latin, he replaced the ring with Christian relics. In any case, it failed. The Danes waited for cover and snuck away to Exeter, where Alfred once again besieged them, this time forcing them to leave.
So far, I'm not seeing much greatness here.
It gets worse. During Christmas in 877, the Danish king Guthrum suddenly seized the royal estate at Chippenham, where Alfred and the royal court was celebrating the holiday. Alfred was taken completely by surprise. He barely managed to escape capture. Guthrum followed it up by overrunning the greater part of western Wessex. To save himself and his family, Alfred took refuge on a small island in the Somerset marshes, an area he knew well from hunting. Alfred built a fortress on the Isle of Athelney and used it as a base for raiding the Danes and those landowners who had thrown in with them. The Danish victory had been due in part to the speed with which they acted, and in part due to the collaboration of some of the West Saxon nobility.
Is this where Alfred burnt the cakes?
This is where Alfred is supposed to have burnt the cakes. The story is that Alfred, traveling incognito, took refuge in the hut of a swineherd. The swineherd's wife charged him with minding the cakes baking in the oven, but the distracted fugitive king allowed them to burn. The wife shrewishly scolded him for his inattention. Alfred, remembering the biblical verses, quote, "Whom the Lord loves, he chastises. He scourges every son whom he adopts," patiently bore her reproofs, which won him the miraculous aid of Saint Neots.
Is that an Asser?
No, but it was inserted into Asser's life in medieval copies of the work. The story originated in the 11th century. It's a moral lesson in Christian patience and humility. What Alfred was doing in his island retreat at Athelney that winter was raiding estates held by the Danes and their supporters and rounding up support for a decisive battle. That battle took place at Edington in the spring of 878. Alfred's forces routed Guthrum's army, pursued it to the royal villa of Chippenham, and besieged it into submission. This time, Alfred wasn't going to be satisfied with the promise that the Danes would leave Wessex. He was going to force them to make a durable peace on his terms.
Okay, and how did he do that?
By transforming Guthrum from a pagan Viking chieftain into a Christian king with whom he could do business. The Treaty of Wedmer required Guthrum's conversion to Christianity, but it also acknowledged Guthrum as king of East Anglia. The boundary between Alfred's and Guthrum's kingdom ran through Mercia.
Were the merchants party to this treaty?
Apparently not. In 877, the Danes had divided Mercia into two parts. The western half remained in the hands of the native king whom they had placed on the throne, Ceolwulf II. The eastern half was settled and ruled by Danes. The really big loser at Edington wasn't Guthrum. It was Ceolwulf II, who disappears from the historical record at this time. His successor in Mercia was an atheling named Athelred, who submitted to Alfred's lordship. Athelred's loyalty was sealed by his marriage to Alfred's daughter, Ethelfled.
Ah, the famous warrior princess Ethelfled, Lady of the Merchants.
Alfred's insistence that Guthrum and his chief men convert is significant. Alfred himself stood sponsor for Guthrum at his baptism and hence became his spiritual father. Guthrum adopted the Christian name Athelstan, which had been the name of Alfred's deceased older brother. By standing sponsor for Guthrum at his baptism, Alfred was recognizing the Danish king's legitimacy as ruler of East Anglia. He was welcoming Guthrum into the company of civilized rulers.
How seriously did Guthrum take his conversion? I remember a story in which a Viking berated a priest for giving him second-rate baptismal robes, saying that they were much better the last time he got baptized.
It's impossible to say. We do know that Guthrum issued coins as king of East Anglia under his baptismal name Athelstan. If Guthrum truly converted, it was because Edington had persuaded him of the great power and majesty of the Christian God, the Lord of battles, and of his agent on earth, King Alfred.
Sort of like the conversion of Constantine the Great on the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. If you see a cross suddenly appear over the face of the sun and see the words, "In this sign you will conquer," that's a strong argument for conversion.
The Frankish king Clovis is also supposed to have had a battlefield conversion. They all shared a worldview in which victory and defeat depended upon divine favor or disfavor.
Okay, so is Alfred's victory at Edington what made him great?
It's how he followed it up that makes him great. The near disaster of the winter of 878, even more than the victory in the spring, left its mark on Alfred and shaped his subsequent policies. If Edington highlighted Alfred's ability to inspire and lead troops in battle, the events that preceded the battle illustrated just dramatically what was wrong with the military system that Alfred had inherited from his father. It had been shaped by the sort of warfare that prevailed among the kingdoms of early England. Though the goal of the Vikings, the acquisition of wealth in all its forms, was familiar to equally predatory Anglo-Saxon kings, The manner in which they waged war was radically new and disconcerting. While Anglo-Saxon commanders sought battle, Vikings avoided it. They much preferred to loot an undefended monastery or town to risking their earnings in a battle that promised little in the way of profit. As Alfred learned firsthand, their modus operandi involved seizing a defendable site, often a royal estate, and then fortifying it further with ditches, ramparts, and palisades. From that base, they would ride through the countryside, plundering as they went. If confronted by a superior military force, they would retreat to their camp. As slight as the camp's makeshift defenses were, they nonetheless proved effective against an enemy unfamiliar with siege warfare and saddled with a logistical system designed for short, decisive campaigns. A besieged Viking army would simply outweight the enemy, knowing that once the besieging force exhausted its supplies, it would either have to leave or offer a profitable peace. Or, if the besiegers grew careless, the Vikings might burst out suddenly from behind their defenses in a furious counterattack or sneak away under cover of night. Anglo-Saxon commanders thus often found themselves outmaneuvered or stalemated. The logistical inadequacies of the existing West Saxon military system were further exacerbated by the manner in which armies were raised. Assembling ad hoc levies of local landowners and their followers was time-consuming. Viking raiders could ravage an entire region before the king's army appeared in the field. There was another drawback to relying upon the military obligations of landowners. The private interests of such men might well favor collaboration with the enemy. In 878, many West Saxon landowners apparently had found it expedient to submit to Guthrum, just as the Mercian prince Ceolwulf and his followers had done in 874. Nationalism, after all, was no impediment to dealing with the Northmen, and even their heathenism could be conveniently overlooked if the threat or the payoff was great enough.
So, what did Alfred's reorganization of the West Saxon military entail?
Basically, it had 5 elements. 1. The construction of 30 fortified towns called burghs. The modern word is borough. Each of the towns would be constructed to dominate the rivers and Roman roads of Wessex. 2. Reforming the royal army, the Fyrd, into a mounted field force consisting of his nobles and their warrior retainers. Rather than ad hoc levies, the Fyrd was now to be a standing army consisting of 2 rotating contingents, which alternated every 2 months between service in the field and protection of their locality. 3. The creation of a beacon warning system linked to the burghs. 4. The building of a small royal navy. 5. A program of reviving learning and spirituality.
Number 5 doesn't sound very military.
It was, but I'll get to that after I explain the purpose of the other 4. Each element of the system was designed to be a specific remedy to defects in the existing West Saxon military establishment exposed by the Viking invasions. If under the existing system, Alfred could not assemble forces quickly enough to intercept mobile Viking raiders, the obvious answer was to have a standing field force. If this entailed transforming the West Saxon Fyrd from a sporadic levy of king's men and their retainers into a mounted standing army, so be it. If his kingdom lacked strong points to impede the progress of an enemy army, he would build them. If the enemy struck from the sea, he would counter them with his own naval power. Characteristically, all of Alfred's innovations were firmly rooted in traditional West Saxon practice, drawing as they did upon the traditional common burdens owed by landowners. Bridge work, fortress repair, and military service on the king's campaigns. Where Alfred revealed his genius was in designing the field force and fortified towns to be parts of a coherent military system. Neither Alfred's reformed Fyrd nor his burghs alone would have afforded a sufficient defense against the Vikings. Together, however, they robbed the Vikings of their major strategic advantages, surprise and mobility.
Were Alfred's burghs like the late massive stone shore forts that you can still see today along the southern coast of Britain?
Not nearly as impressive physically. The burgh defenses consisted mainly of massive earthworks, large earthen walls surrounded by wide ditches. The earthen walls probably were surmounted with wooden palisades. The size of the burhs varied greatly from tiny fortifications such as Pilton to large towns like Winchester. Alfred's 30 burhs were distributed widely throughout the West Saxon kingdom and situated in such a manner that no part of the kingdom was more than 20 miles, a day's march, from a fortified center. These burhs dominated the kingdom's lines of communication, the navigable rivers, Roman roads, major trackways. There were smaller roads built to facilitate mobilization. These were called heroways, literally army roads.
Okay, from which we get highways.
Appropriate given that Eisenhower's interstate highway system was built to facilitate the movement of troops.
How were the burhs supposed to function in practice? Were they mainly defensive fortifications?
Burhs undoubtedly served as places of refuge for the populations of the surrounding countryside. But these fortresses were not mere static points of defense. They were designed to operate in conjunction with Alfred's mobile standing army and with each other. To do this effectively required a carefully planned system of communication based on the established routeways with observation and signaling posts.
Okay, a beacon system like in the movie Lord of the Rings, Return of the King.
Yes, and I think the movie gave a good sense of how an Anglo-Saxon beacon system would have worked in practice.
I thought what made Hadrian's Wall an effective barrier was the garrison forts built into it. If it hadn't been constantly manned, it wouldn't have worked as a preclusive barrier. Were Alfred's burhs garrisoned on a permanent basis, at least in his lifetime?
They were, which is really remarkable. The cost of building the burhs was great in itself, but that's nothing compared with the upkeep for these fortresses and the recruitment and maintenance of their standing garrisons. Alfred was not an absolute king. Royal power and authority was limited in 9th century England. The king was chosen by the great men of the realm. They dominated their localities. As ealdormen, they were officially agents of the king. But unless the king was present, they were more like rulers over their shires. Asser tells us that Alfred had to cajole, persuade, and when his patience was exhausted, chastise these landowners to contribute the labor needed to build and maintain the burhs. What he couldn't do was really coerce them.
Well, he could hold over them the threat of Viking invasion.
But he had to be careful in doing this. The Vikings were more than willing to cut deals with ambitious local magnates. He had to sell the West Saxon magnates that it would be more to their advantage to obey him, regardless of how much he was asking of them, than to try to make a deal with the notoriously untrustworthy Danes.
How many men are we talking about for the garrisons of these 30 fortified towns?
27,071 men.
That's a pretty precise figure. How did you come up with it?
Because of a remarkable early 10th century document known as the burghal. The burghal is an administrative document that lists 31 burhs in a geographical order that make a circuit around Wessex. Each burh is assigned a specific number of hides.
On behalf of our listeners, please explain what you mean by hide.
The hide was the basic unit of Anglo-Saxon taxation. It originally was defined as the amount of land needed to support a single family. By the 9th century, it was a notional 120 acres.
What do you mean by notional?
The actual acreage of a hide varied according to the agricultural quality of the land. Another way of thinking about it is that an estate was assigned its hidage according to the agricultural value of the property at the rate of 1 hide for every pound of annual revenue. Like I said, it was a unit of taxation.
Okay, so what did it mean to assign a burh a certain number of hides?
It's the number of men needed to guard the burh's walls. Attached to the burghal hidage is a formula for determining the size of the burh's garrison on the basis of 1 man needed for every 5.5 yards of wall. The number of men equals the number of hides assigned to the burh because landowners were to supply 1 man for each hide of land they held. The hidage total for a burh reflects the size of the administrative district created to provide for its defense. To give a couple of examples, Winchester, a town whose wall circuit ran 9,900 feet, was assigned 2,400 hides, meaning it had a burghal district totaling 2,400 hides, which would produce 2,400 men for its garrison. Shaftesbury, a small fort with only 2,887 feet of wall, was assigned only 700 hides, hence a garrison of 700 men.
Okay, so who were these 27,071 men?
They were recruited from the free tenants of the landowners within a burghal district. Each landowner, as I said, was obligated to send to the burgh a quota of men determined by the hidage of his or her estate. I'm not sure how these men were chosen, but I suspect that many were volunteers who held little or no land of their own and saw this as an opportunity for advancement. As garrison troops, they became king's men. In return for the townhouses given to them, they were obligated to guard the walls if the town was attacked, maintain its defenses in good repair, and join royal expeditions if summoned. They also probably had jobs. In other words, they were a lot like the Roman frontier troops guarding Hadrian's Wall in the 4th and 5th centuries.
27,071 doesn't seem an outrageously large number for the total armed forces of the kingdom.
Depends on the population of the kingdom. The full population of Wessex, as reported in Domesday Book in 1086, was about 500,000. It was probably less than that in 890. In addition to the 27,000 garrison troops, Alfred also had a mobile field force, the Fyrd, which I would estimate was probably around 3,000 men. So we're talking about 30,000 men. And 30,000 would have been 6% of the kingdom's total population. To put this in historical perspective, the Prussian military at the height of the Napoleonic Wars only absorbed 4% of that state's population. An American military comprising 6% of the present population would number more than 20 million troops.
Okay, forgive me, but what's the size of the American military?
The combined total for all the military services is 1.4 million men and women.
Huh, okay. So Alfred's preparations to defend against the next Viking attack are impressive, but how well did it work in practice?
It worked exactly as planned. In the 880s, the Vikings were involved in raids in Francia. Their failure to take Paris in 886, followed by a crushing defeat in battle in 891 at the hands of King Alfred of East Francia, led them to cross back to England in 892. A force of 250 ships landed in southeast Kent. A second Viking fleet of 80 ships followed and sailed into the Thames estuary, making camp in northern Kent. Opportunistic Danish settlers in East Anglia and Northumbria broke the peace to raid Wessex once more. For the next 4 years, Alfred waged war on several fronts against invaders. Alfred's defensive measures were not yet complete, and the Vikings even captured one ill-defended, half-built burgh in Kent. But Alfred had created a strong enough defensive system to harry the Vikings and negate their threat. In 896, the Viking army dispersed and returned to Francia. The Viking invasion failed not because the English commanders were cleverer or their men more resolute, but because of a complex and sophisticated military system that permitted the English to fight a multi-front war. The Vikings had discovered that English towns were no longer easy prey. It was dangerous to leave a garrison burgh intact, but it was equally dangerous to attempt to take one. The Vikings could not storm burghs protected by ditches, earthworks, strengthened by wooden revetments and palisades. If they attempted to starve a town into submission, the hunter was likely to become the hunted, as the English field army and garrisons from neighboring burghs would come to the relief of the besieged town. The very geography of this last war attested to the effectiveness of Alfred's military reforms. In the invasions and raids of 871, 876, and 878, the Danes had attacked and ravaged the heartland of Wessex. In 892 to 896, an even larger army with allies in Northumbria and East Anglia had to content itself with raiding along the frontiers of Wessex and Mercia. Only once had Viking raiders penetrated the countryside of Surrey or Hampshire, and these marauders had paid for their daring in a defeat at Farnham.
Okay. We started with Rule Britannia, and you said that Alfred was credited by the Victorians with being the father of the Royal Navy, but so far you haven't mentioned that.
The British have had 5 iterations of the HMS Alfred, beginning in 1778, and the United States Continental Navy commissioned the USS Alfred. All of this is based on a notice in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that describes how Alfred tried his hand at naval design. In 896, he ordered the construction of a small fleet, perhaps a dozen or so longships, that at 60 oars were twice the size of Viking warships. The Anglo-Saxon chronicler flattered his royal patron by boasting that Alfred's ships were not only larger, but they were swifter, steadier, and rode higher in the water than either Danish or Frisian ships. Alfred had sea power in mind. If he could intercept raiding fleets before they landed, he could spare his kingdom from ravaging.
I take it that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reports Alfred's innovative ship design because it proved successful.
Not as successful as you might think. In conception, Alfred's ships may have been superior, but in practice, they left a bit to be desired. His ships proved to be too large to maneuver well in the close waters of estuaries and rivers, the only places in which a naval battle could occur. In the one recorded naval engagement, Alfred's new fleet intercepted 6 Viking ships in the mouth of an unidentified river along the south of England. The Danes had beached half their ships, either to rest their rowers or forage for food, or both. Alfred's ships immediately moved to block their escape to the sea. The 3 Viking ships afloat attempted to break through the English lines. Only one made it. Alfred's ships intercepted the other 2. Lashing the Viking boats to their own, the English crew boarded the enemy vessels and proceeded to kill everyone on board. The one ship that escaped managed to do so only because all of Alfred's heavy ships became grounded when the tide ran out. What ensued was a land battle between the crews of the grounded ships. The Danes, heavily outnumbered, would have been wiped out if the tide had not risen. When that occurred, the Danes rushed back to their boats, which were lighter and had shallower drafts, and were freed before Alfred's ships. Helplessly, the English watched as the Vikings rode past them. But the pirates had suffered so many casualties, 120 dead according to the Chronicle, that they had difficulties putting out to sea. 2 of the 3 ships were driven against the Sussex coast. The shipwrecked sailors were brought before Alfred at Winchester and hanged.
So you see Alfred's greatness in terms of his strategic vision and reorganization of the defenses of Wessex.
Only in part. His cultural accomplishments are equally important. In the 880s, at the same time that he was cajoling and threatening his nobles to build and man the burghs, Alfred undertook an equally ambitious effort to revive learning. This had several parts. He recruited a coterie of clerical scholars from Mercia, Wales, and Francia to aid him in his own studies and to enhance the tenor of the court and the quality of the episcopacy. Because he believed that wisdom attained through the study of books is the foundation of good government, he established a court school to educate his own children and those of his nobles. He demanded that those who held offices of authority should be literate in the vernacular, and if they weren't, that they should have aides who were.
In the vernacular? You mean in Old English? I thought Latin was the language of scholarship as well as the church. I thought the Carolingian Renaissance was about the restoration of Latin learning.
It was, and that's one of the remarkable things about the Alfredian Renaissance. The literacy Alfred demanded of his officials and which he promoted among the secular nobility was in English. Latin remained the language of the church, but in England, unlike Francia, the vernacular became the language of both administration and literature.
You earlier mentioned Alfred's translations of Latin works into English.
That was probably his most personal undertaking, though he also meant that his translations should be read by others. We know that he sent copies of his translation of Pope Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care to his bishops along with expensive astels pointer sticks to facilitate the reading of manuscripts. Alfred's goal was to promote to a wider audience than simply Latin readers the wisdom contained in the books that he believed it was important for all to know.
So you do continue to accept his authorship of the Old English translations of Pastoral Care, the Consolations of Philosophy, Augustine's Soliloquies, and the first 50 Psalms.
I do. I think it's hard not to accept the Pastoral Care as Alfred's. Alfred explicitly says in the preface, I wrote it. Quote, I then began, amidst the various and multifarious afflictions of this kingdom, to translate into English the book which in Latin is called Pastoralis, sometimes word for word and sometimes sense for sense, as I learnt it from Plegmont, my archbishop, and from Asser, my bishop, and from Grimbald, my mass priest. After I had mastered it, I translated it into English as best I understood it, and as I could most meaningfully render it. As I said at the beginning of this episode, there is currently scholarly controversy over the authorship of the other translations. But I stand here with Professor Janet Bately, whose knowledge of Old English is unrivaled, and who's had a long and distinguished career studying the translations attributed to Alfred. I am persuaded by her arguments that linguistically all these works share a common author, and that author is Alfred.
Citing authority. How medieval of you.
I could do a lot worse than Professor Bately. Alfred encouraged others in his court also to undertake translations and commissioned the composition of a chronicle recording the history of the English people, focusing, however, on the rise of Alfred's kingdom of Wessex and Alfred's house.
Oh, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle.
Yes, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Alfred also issued a law code. In the preface to that law code, Alfred presented the West Saxons as a new people of Israel and their king as a just and divinely inspired lawgiver.
So how do you reconcile Alfred the military strategist and warrior king with Alfred the pious scholar?
It's a mistake, I think, to see either Alfred's or Charlemagne's promotion of learning and religion as separate from their military endeavors. The revival of learning in Wessex was to Alfred's mind as essential for the defense of his realm as the building of the burghs. As Alfred observed in the preface to his translation of Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, kings who fail to obey their divine duty to promote learning can expect earthly punishments to befall their people. The pursuit of wisdom, he assured his readers of the Boethius, was the surest path to power. Quote, study wisdom then, and when you have learned it, condemn it not, for I tell you that by its means you may without fail attain to power, yea, even though not desiring it. The portrayal by Asser in the Anglo-Saxon chronicler of the West Saxon resistance to the Vikings as a Christian holy war was more than mere rhetoric or propaganda. It reflected Alfred's own belief in a doctrine of divine rewards and punishments, rooted in a vision of a hierarchical Christian world order in which God is the Lord to whom all kings owe obedience and through whom they derive their authority over their followers. The need to persuade his nobles to undertake work for the common good led Alfred and his court scholars to strengthen and deepen the conception of Christian kingship that he had inherited by building upon the legacy of earlier kings such as Offa, as well as clerical writers such as Bede, Alcuin, and the other luminaries of the Carolingian Renaissance. This was not a cynical use of religion to manipulate his subjects into obedience, but an intrinsic element in Alfred's worldview. He believed, as did other kings in 9th century England and Francia, that God had entrusted him with the spiritual as well as physical welfare of his people. If the Christian faith fell into ruin in his kingdom, if the clergy were too ignorant to understand the Latin words they butchered in their offices and liturgies, if the ancient monasteries and collegiate churches lay deserted out of indifference, he, as king, was answerable for God as Josiah had been. Alfred's ultimate responsibility was the pastoral care of his people.
Okay, I can see how Alfred, as an educated military man, would appeal to the Victorians.
When I first started teaching at the Naval Academy, there was posted on the bulletin board outside the offices of the Division of Humanities and Social Sciences a quotation from an obscure Victorian general, Sir William Butler, quote, "The nation that will insist upon drawing a broad line of demarcation between the fighting man and the thinking man is likely to have its fighting done by fools and its thinking by cowards."
Okay, that's an appropriate sentiment for an institution devoted to educating future Navy and Marine officers. We are running out of time. How would you sum up the significance of Alfred's reign?
Alfred's military reforms saved his kingdom from Scandinavian conquest, while the Alfredian Renaissance not only revived learning, but helped create a strong theocratic conception of kingship that helped Alfred and his successors rule more effectively. Alfred's burghal system provided the West Saxon monarchy with islands of royal power throughout southern England. The burghs, which were to serve as sites of royal mints and as trading centers as well as fortresses, gave Alfred and his successors more wealth and a greater amount of coercive power than their predecessors possessed. In short, the response to the Viking invasions in England was not the destruction of central authority, as it was in Francia, but was the consolidation and growth of kingly power. England did not become decentralized as did France. Instead, the king managed to control his nobility and to exact from their lands taxes and military service. Alfred's son, daughter, and grandsons used their wealth and military resources to conquer the areas of Viking settlements north of the Thames, the so-called Danelaw. By the reign of Edgar the Peacekeeper, reigned from 959 to 975, the kings of Wessex had fully become kings of England and lords of Britain.
So, that is why you think that he really was the great.
Yes, clearly I'm one of those biographers who fell in love with the subject, but other historians might be more measured in their appreciation.
And we'll find out in the next 2 episodes in conversation with 2 of Richard's British colleagues, Professors Barbara York and Ryan Lavelle. I'm looking forward to that.
I hope that you'll be able to join us.